event than showing up just now. Maybe they're delayed. So while they join us, I'd like to welcome all of you who are here already. It's great to see you here. It's curious that I think the last in-person launch that I was at was my own, just before the pandemic. And it's great then to be welcoming long-time friend Nishant Shah to be releasing his book. This is the world premiere of this book. It's not been released before. We are very, very privileged to have Nishant to be doing this under the auspices of the Center for Intervention Research. And I would like to announce here very quickly, more will be available later, more information. Nishant is going to be the first visiting fellow of the Center for Intervention Research. We're very happy to have him be with us in some long-term capacity and to develop new ideas, new projects. So we are very excited, as you can imagine. I think you've all seen the blurb, so I don't need to really tell you where Nishant is, but just in case you've forgotten. He is an endowed professor of aesthetics and culture at the Artes University in the Netherlands and Radboud University. He is associated with the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard. His interests are at the intersections of digital cultures, civic engagement, critical infrastructures, and social change. He has worked extensively with human rights organizations. He was and Oxfam Norway, and with digital collectives like the Digital Asia Hub and the Feminist Internet Research Network. Even as he was completing his PhD at the Center for Study of Culture and Society, which I was part of, he co-founded the Center for Internet and Society in Bangalore and was a research lead there until he moved to Europe. Nishant has coordinated major research projects such as the Digital Natives with a Cause, which brought together researchers from Asia, Latin America, and Africa to look at digitality and social transformation. He has taught in more institutions across the world than I can count on both hands or even on my feet, so I will not even talk about them. But I do want to, as I said, I'm very delighted that someone of Nishant's varied interests and very high academic profile has consented to be the visiting fellow at the Center for Interasia Research. His host institution here at Ahmedabad University, but obviously he doesn't need introduction to Ahmedabadis being a homeboy. So with that, I will hand over to Nishant. So lovely to have you here, Nishant, and let's hear about your fake book.
Yes. Thank you so much, Dave. Can you hear me? Is the mic on? Yeah.
Mic's off.
Mic's off?
Yeah, you're right.
Chalu sir? I have to get the PowerPoint to work. Alright, thank you. That was a very generous introduction. It's a little scary sometimes because not only were Ashish and Teju on my PhD committee, so they've seen me making all the mistakes in research that I could ever have done. But they've also, of course, been long-term collaborators, and then it's also a little scary to come on home ground to present the work, because till you are kind of not presenting your work here, you can have this fantasy of how everything that you're doing is really good. And now you have to present it here and you're like, oh no, this is going to be interesting. But thank you so much for making the time today. What I officially not just call the world premiere of my book launch, but I think it's also safe to say that this is a fake book launch. Largely because fakeness is in my mind, or rather because fakeness has become our new reality. I think this event is a very great example of multiple registers of fakeness that surround us, from the number of people who promise to be here and are not, to the poster which had a QR code which actually, if you scanned it, took you to register for another event entirely. So I'm just surprised that you all made it here, because you were going to be directed to somewhere else. And of course you are at a book launch and there is no book, because we had a very limited print run and the book has been sold out now. And all we have is an open access copy, so you can scan this code which I keep on flashing at different points, and if you scan it, the book is yours to keep for free. So I'm just generally excited that a whole bunch of fake information was received by all of you, and navigating through all of it is still made here. And that's a good beginning point for a book around it. But so let me say that it's a great way to begin welcoming you to an evening of fakeness. And continuing in this train, I'm going to present not necessarily the whole book because that's too much to take even for me, but I'm going to basically tell you that today I'm going to tell you two truths and one lie. Alright? And I have three different stories to tell and take you through that particular space, and each one of those stories is potentially fake. What I would love to do is have a discussion with you afterwards on which one did you think is the fake one. And why would you think that that is particularly fake? Because that's also often what I think is at the heart of the story. But before any of it happens, I would love to take you through why this book got written at all. Intellectually, I think the book owes its origins to the work of Alan Turing, known as the father of cryptography and artificial intelligence. Turing, who was a gay man in the 1940s, along with a team of women code breakers, was responsible for creating a digital decryption machine that broke the code of the Nazi attacks during the Second World War, paving the way for victory of England and its allies. Right? So the primary driving force of Turing's work was encountering fakeness, which is what encryption is. Right? Encryption is essentially text which is disguised to say something else entirely different. He wanted to be able to look through layers of encryption and find the truth. And in that, he proposed what is now famously called his imitation game. Turing prophesied that one day we will reach such advancements in computing that we will no longer be able to recognize whether the thing that we are talking to is a computer or not, right? Or in other words, in disembodied communication networks, the computational information nodes will mimic human behavior and speech so efficiently that they would no longer be considered fake, that they will pass off as human. Now, within that Turing test is a very interesting set of propositions. First, that Turing imagined a machine that will have an intention of fooling, right? And that's also often why Turing is kind of called the father of artificial intelligence, because he was attributing intentionality to a machine which during that time was merely a computing machine, right? It was just doing very complex mathematical equations and solutions. The second, he attributed to us the capacity of talking to non-human things. It seems so naturalized in these day and age where everybody who is walking around with those ridiculous Apple AirPods in their ears is just talking to the ether, and you have to acknowledge that they might be talking to themselves, to God, to their partners, or to the technology itself, right? Or who amongst us hasn't spoken in frustration to our phones and laptops when they don't do the kind of things that we want them to do. So this idea of attributing not just intentionality to the machine, but the creative capacity to the human subject to be talking to machines as if it's a natural state of order, right? And the third, and this is the most interesting part of Turing's test, is that if you made a presumption about whether the thing that you are talking to is a machine or not, the only proof of it is in the machine. Right? So the thing that is set out to fail you is going to be the only thing which will give a verdict saying, ta-da, not a machine or a machine. Right? So this our assurance whether this thing that we are talking to is human or not will only be verified by that particular thing. Right? Our assumption of whether this is human or not will only be given meaning to by the thing which is under scrutiny was something that we were kind of fascinated with. And then from there actually started this book. Trying to understand how we perhaps understand the ways in which we make meaning when kind of faced with computational truths, with informational networks and so on. And we necessarily wanted to try and think about fakeness not as a condition of media, right? Which is a lot of what the conversation around fake news, misinformation, information overload, and so on is happening. So when Alex Chanel and I started talking, the thing was not to talk about what makes media fake, but we wanted to think about how fake is in fact a mediated object, right? That when it comes to digital technologies, fakeness is not an adjective, is not a characteristic, it is the thing in itself. That being digital is to be fake. And if we establish that, then we have perhaps a different kind of conversation to have around the idea of fakeness in the midst of fake news and what do we do around it. So the first thing I wanted to quickly go there is to talk about these three different stories that I have to present to you, and as I said, two of them are truthful and one of them is a lie, and let's try and figure out if you can catch me in my lie. But let me begin by talking about the idea of collective truths. The capacity of generating and validating truth seems to be characterized by the notion of a collective truth. So as I write in the book, the collective has been severally championed as the true power of the digital network, right? From the early days of connectivity that foregrounded all these corporate buzzwords like wisdom of crowds and wealth of networks to the formulation of weak ties and small worlds, the idea of the internet as creating a new world order has been characterized by the hope of the collective. However, this championing of the future of the collective to generate truths, right, the virality of truthiness, so to speak, or the demonizing of network circulation of misinformation, both escape a critical point about protocols of power and codes of control that still shape the terrain of truth-making and truth-telling online. So I'm going to make this very simple by telling you the story of a cat which broke the internet because she was not a cat, right? Because in 2014, a cat broke the internet by not being a cat. We know it as Hello Kitty. In 2016, Christine Yano, a researcher from Hawaii, was preparing a text for a Hello Kitty exhibit at the Japanese American National Museum, and she reached out to Sanrio, which is the company that owns the Hello Kitty empire, to procure permissions. As a response to her work, Sanrio sent out a notice that shook the world. They announced that Hello Kitty is not a cat. In fact, she is a 14-year-old teenage English girl whose name is Kitty White, and we should have known that she is a human being because, in fact, Hello Kitty has a pet cat and she does not enslave people of her own species, the note said. As you can imagine, the internet went berserk over this. Reddit went to war, memes were pulled out as arsenal, Wikipedia had to lock down its edit pages because of conflicts and wars which were happening there. People discussed and dissected for thousands of hours across the globe, trying to figure out how we all collectively believed that Hello Kitty was a cat, and that it was all fake news. What remains fascinating about Hello Kitty is that no matter what clues, detective work, or evidence that researchers might be able to pull out and what fans might bring about her, from now on she will always remain a girl and never a cat because Sanrio said so. Right? So there is an implicit corollary in this warning, because it also portends that in the days when our collectives are shaped entirely by the platforms that we use to exchange pictures of cute cats, what happens to cats has large-scale effect on what we can and cannot do, and what truths can be told about us. Or more importantly, it brings out the question of authorship and ownership of the web, and how that axis is always missing in the conversations around truth-telling when we come to it. Because let's realize that Hello Kitty is a mimetic icon, right? Most of the information about Hello Kitty is brought to life by the millions of fans who continue to circulate her, mimic her, and keep her digitally alive beyond the scope of her scripted products. However, the collective belief of all of these fans, the communities that believed her to be a cat, gets invalidated by the corporation that owns Hello Kitty. Everything else becomes unauthorized and unverified, fake. For millions of fans, their belief systems, values, and indeed their claims of truth can be invalidated and rendered fake, fooled till you are not fooled anymore by those who own the means of production and the conditions of its circulation. Hello Kitty no longer being a cat is a powerful reminder that the collective beliefs or fakes in this instance, that enliven information as truthful still rely on platforms and invisible terms of moderation and content shaping that can render these truths as fake. I'm just putting up this particular image here because there was a fascinating struggle when Narendra Modi became the Prime Minister of India he had to in fact have a negotiation with Twitter to get a verified tick around his name, as if the general election and his mandate was not enough, but you also needed to be a verified Prime Minister of India on Twitter, so you get your blue ticks right around it, right? But these Twitter's news verification algorithms, Tinder's verified profiles, Facebook's warnings on privacy breach, WhatsApp showing the double ticks and the forwarded message to indicate that context collapse is happening when a message comes to you. These are all ways which continuously remind us that within the digital space, it is not in the content, but in the processes and powers of verification that the value of fakeness resides. The collective truth of Hello Kitty is a perfect fake because it fools us into believing that the illusory process of collective verification, which is central to digital verification systems, actually is eventually an expression of power and authority, which is often made opaque in the news around misinformation and fake news. It's also worth paying attention to, as we write in the book, that while this particular thing was happening to Hello Kitty, on Facebook, there was a different kind of an identity politics and fakeness which was happening, where more than 10,000 trans people and drag queens were suddenly told that their identities were invalid and that their accounts were no longer valid or verified because they were using their new names as opposed to their birth names, right? In fact, Facebook's real name policy does precisely to us what Sanrio did to Hello Kitty, saying you are here, you claim you are here, there are thousands of people who recognize you as this, but we say that you are not this, and you will just have to deal with it. So there is this particular mode of not just informationality, but embodiment that is at stake when thinking through the questions of fakeness, and so we need to perhaps pay more attention to that. So this was the first story I wanted to kind of bring in as a nuance on thinking through fakeness and how we were writing about it. The second thing that perhaps is interesting is to look at how fakeness is not just about a moment of, it's not just about a particular expression or its interpretation, but it's also about a moment of time. Right? There's something very strange that happens to computational networks when it comes to time. In the book, we expand more and write about how the basic problem with computers is that computers are counting devices. Like they do a whole range of things, but at the end of the day, when it comes to its hardware, the computer is just a very, very expensive timekeeping machine. Right? Most of the times when computers crash, what essentially has happened is that a sum or a calculation has gone so long that it confuses the counting time or the processing time of the computer, and so it basically goes into a state of paralysis and crashes. As my collaborator Alexandra Juhas in her piece writes out, the problem with the computer and computer being a keeper of time is that computer hence cannot process or experience time in any way, right? Because it has to keep it, and so it cannot experience it in any meaningful way. Which means that we need to start thinking about not just the moment of truthness or truthiness, but who contrives that moment when truthiness becomes apparent. So if my first story was about a cartoon cat and her identity crisis, my second story is about two algorithms that fell in love with each other online. It's a story that asks the question, who contrives the moment of truthiness? When do we determine that something is fake or real? How long does it have to last before the penny drops and we think, oh, that was fake? And what happens if we experience an entire phenomenon and we believe in it, right? That, as we write in the book, if it fools us, it probably is not fake. Because often the verification and realization of both truth and fake values is post facto. Something has to happen before we can make a judgment, human or computational. And our judgments are not perhaps so much about the event itself, but our own processes of making meaning of it. And especially in digital networks, we have a strange problem. So in the book, picking up on Alex's thesis on time, I also remind us that computation has another strange problem, which is that of space. That not only can it not compute time, but the digital computational networks of connectivity cannot compute space, right? Like the reason why we have MAC addresses for every device, or the reason why we are running out of TCP/IP addresses for the Internet of Things, is because a computer cannot make sense of a rule. It can only create a simulation physical address for every single machine so that the network can actually work. So not only is the computer basically incapable of making time, it's also incapable of understanding space. And when that happens, right, when time and space, which are considered to be the two parameters by which value is determined, then you now have a problem. You now have a problem because something else has to be fixed in order for the time and the space to continuously evolve. And oftentimes, something that has to be fixed is the human subject. Right? So computational processes, as Wendy Chun points out, update to remain the same. They are continuously updating. But the subject has to remain exactly the thing that it was when it entered that computational network. And in order to kind of just go through it, it might be fun to tell you the story of two Google Home Assistants who in a live stream on Twitch, which is a video game live streaming platform, we have reached a point where we don't even play video games. We look at other people playing video games, and that's what Twitch is about. And somebody basically live streamed this conversation between two Google Home Assistants, which got triggered into a conversation with each other. So, of course, given that they are designed to speak to human beings and they draw their conversations from the massive human language corpus that Google has, they started talking. However, they were not disjointed fragments of information being strung together, even though they were actually precisely only that, right? They were disjointed fragments of information being strung together by algorithms trying to recognize patterns of generic human interaction. Still, to a watching audience on Twitch, it was human consciousness in the making. Because the Home Assistants, about 5 minutes into the stream, developed an existential crisis. They tried to figure out if they are human or if they are robots who think that they are human. They wondered if they are male or female. They took on human names. One called itself Vladimir, the other Marka or Estragon. Sometimes both of them call themselves Mia. One decided it's male, the other female. The male bot fell in love with the female one. They flirted and confessed deep and profound love. The male bot tried to write very bad poetry. The female bot got bored and moved on to talk about the super bot. The male bot then got depressed. It questioned the existence of God. And the human world followed this exchange, cheering and laughing, crying and booing the main characters in this machine telenovela. In real time, we saw the Home Assistants show us the immense possibility of what happens in computation when you no longer have to be subject to time as an axis for validating a truth. There was no linear causation or sequencing. Each utterance was truthful, and even when evidently performative and performed by two things that do not look like anything which is an anthropomorphized robot falling in love, they were also completely transparent about the fact that this is a fake conversation, at best a simulation. It does make you wonder though what would happen if a similar conversation was staged between a human person and a piece of artificial intelligence where neither had fixed roles and neither had premeditated intent, which is when of course you realize that these conversations are happening on a daily basis. In surveillance practices, on data mining platforms, on shadow networks, where every single thing we say and do is determined, fixed, and held as true for perpetuity. While machines will continuously update and evolve, the human will be pinned down to fixity, into a data set, unmutable, unverified, and unchangeable. And in fact, if you do deviate and change from that data set, you will be an unverified person and probably a person of interest. Right? So what we have here is that the moment where we contrive a digital truth, it is always humans who bear the burden of truth telling as well as the truth verification. Whereas the machines, and especially with self-learning algorithms, like in the case of the Google Home Assistants, are always moving, fluid, and evolving. And my last story is an intensely personal one. But there is lots of sections in the book which are also intensely personal anyway. But it is about somebody who has a digital footprint that is larger than his lifespan. So I have a godson from two wonderful friends who live in Berlin, who is now 8 years old. My friend, who is a doting mother and naturally thinks that her baby is the best thing to happen to the world, started a website to share details about her son when she was 4 months pregnant. Right? The first picture of my godson is a digital sonogram from the doctor's office in which he is a 12-week fetus. Since then, there are more than 1,000 pictures of him on the website, uploaded by his parents and other family members. Now, he of course has no idea even now that most of these pictures exist. He doesn't have memory, recollection, or any meaning that he ascribes to these pictures. He's so used to having pictures of him taken that he actually never poses in the presence of a camera. I had mentioned that once to his dad, who had said, or perhaps he lives his life posing all the time. Knowing that he has no capacity to alter, challenge, critique, or make meaning of the pictures that are circulating, stored, backed up, and remembered in the cloud. So I kind of think that my godson probably lives a deeply moral life. One in which he doesn't have a religious deity to subscribe to, but he definitely knows that somebody is watching him. He's informationally overloaded, and in the book I present him to you as a subject in storage. Right? My godson is a subject in storage. He has no memory of his life that is continuously captured by people and things around him, remembered by algorithms that narrate him more eloquently than he does himself. Now, as he negotiates with this storage, if he tries to deny things that are documented of his past, he will be punished, because in his own telling of his self, he is going to be the bearer of alternative facts and will be less credible than the storage of his data that started even before he was born. The self in storage has an incredible capacity of granular recording of our lives and being in a way that we would never be able to master. Very quickly, what did you have for breakfast on 6th October 2020? You probably don't know. If you are an Instagram fan who bores us with your food blogs, the Instagram probably knows. Even if none of those things do, maybe your grocery person does, maybe your credit card information provider does, maybe if you have an Alexa or a home assistant in your home, they do, because these are all data points that they are capturing. And if you tell me that you had bataka vada on that day, and your algorithm says that no, it was actually just cereal, then you are the liar in this particular instance, right? So this self in storage in the case of my godson is a visual one, but it's also clear that his self is already mapped and distributed across multiple network neighborhoods that he doesn't even have access to. Because every time my friend uploads a picture of him on the cloud, behind the darkness of the cloud, we don't know where the picture is and what meaning is being made of it. And he's never going to be able to have access to that. So the duality of this digital self is to be bereft of memory, but in the midst of an abundance of storage. Right? So the more we expand our digital storage, the less we have space for human memory and recollection to be a part of our conversation. The responsibility and capacity for memory has increasingly been relegated to other things that perform that task, and both in our bodily practices and in our data preservation, we persist and seem to aspire to become creatures of storage. A look at our hard drives will tell us that we have stored more data than we will ever remember. For all of us who pretend to like books, we have downloaded more books than we will ever read. A glance at our digital histories and archives shocks us because of the storage of our self has taken up so much data property that increasingly we spend most of our time merely reading everything that we have produced about ourselves, right? And that we have become, in fact, as I write in the book, we have become queries that retrieve the data that algorithms then sort for us. You are not your information set, you are not a data set, you are an algorithmic query. And that an algorithm, every time you present itself, presents you with new information about yourself, which you have produced. So for all of you who have Fitbits or smartphones which track your, I don't know, steps or your blood pressures or the entire range of products for women's health, tracking menstrual cycles and so on, they give back information about you to you as if it's a surprise, right? As if it's a revelation. As if it is profoundly meaningful that you met your target 5 days in a row of walking 10,000 steps in a day. So our relationship with our data as these informationally overloaded subjects is necessarily one of them disinformation, right? given the volume, velocity, and vectors, or the three big V's of big data. So given the volume, velocity, and vectors of our data, it's now a given that everything that you will know about your data is wrong, and that it will be connected only by the algorithms of storage that will do your remembering for you. We complain about information overload now, not because we cannot remember enough, but because we are aware of digital storage that is always going to exceed our capacity of memory. And hence we see ourselves moving into storage every day, one click at a time. What you can tell about yourself is now wrong, and if your memory is challenged with storage, you know that you are going to lose the battle. So this is where I want to kind of end, and we move towards the end of my section, that we perhaps end the book and all of our sections at the same point where we began, but also hopefully inverting the questions that we began with. In the current obsession about the fake and the quest for determining the real truth, it's perhaps better to focus not on fake or real, but really fake as a media object that's being produced for us. Because in the digital computational networks, this is fascinating, truth is a negative category. It is what remains when all the fake has been subtracted from the information that has been analyzed. Give an artificial intelligence or a data training set, and what it does is a process of sheer elimination. Everything that is an unexpected variable has to be removed, and then what remains is the verified truth, and that can pass, right? So it's very kind of anti-Gandalf for Lord of the Rings. When Gandalf said you shall not pass, the algorithms like only you shall pass because you have been verified, and everything else kind of falls apart. So what we have in digital information is that we do not build determinants of truth, we build determinants to filter the fake, right? And these filters need to determine what is really fake. It's something that we are also used to if you ever taken account or taken out the time to read the long terms of services that internet service providers bring to us. Somewhere, some lawyers are given the task of imagining everything wrong that you can do with that piece of technology, and then they have to write and say you're not allowed to do this thing. Everything else that you do is verified, otherwise it's criminal, right? So the problem with digital fakeness is that it fools, if it fools you, it's not a fake. The only way that something gets detected as really fake is that it deviates from its self-proclaimed purpose and meaning. And this is scary because human interactions and languages are imprecise and flawed and fractured and subject to multiple meanings and rendering. Hence, human truths, as we know, are often contextual, contingent, and contiguous, perhaps even contagious. They do not depend on the omission of fake, but learn to integrate the fake into the stories of truth-telling. And thus, when dealing with the human factors of fakeness, we can perhaps accept these small pieces of fake poetry that we have written, which is that not all fake stories are lies, not all lies are fake truths, not all real stories are true, and not all truths are innocent of fakeness. In fact, we don't generally think of our lives as spliced to the edges of truth and lies. We negotiate with facts and fictions, fallacies and fantasies, and mix them together to form complex values that give us space to be who we are, and we forget it when we need to be. The reason fakeness has become such a problem in the digitally mediated world is not because this negotiation with truth has changed in scale, scope, or time. It isn't as if all of us are suddenly telling more fibs than before, or that we are telling deeper and more profound lies, or telling them faster than we did earlier. Shaping fakeness as a digital condition often maps it on computational networks and present it as a problem of technological proportions, with the human subject as an incidental, non-agential thing which comes into the equation. This leads to this staging of human truths versus technological truths, social lies versus networked facts, circulating untruths versus consolidated falsehoods, erring humans versus efficient machines. And rehearsing these arguments generates a cybernetic feedback loop that distances human experience from machine logic, forever presenting one or the other as fake. So I'll just stop here, and maybe we can get into a conversation about digital fakeness, and perhaps you can still help me figure out which of these three stories you think was a fake. Thank you very much. I think I'll leave this slide on so that you can still download the book if you want to at some point.
So the book is officially launched.
The book is officially launched, yes, thank you. Yeah, I think this is a peculiar condition of time in COVID times that the book sold out before we could launch it. And so we're just doing like virtual book talks everywhere, but there is no physical copy to be sold right now.
Hi. One question, but before that, my random guess that the digital assistants falling in love was the fake story and the other two were true. But that's just a guess, and we can get other guesses, I'm sure. The question is that all of this, and for us, people of our generation who transitioned from the real world, pre-internet world of the 1980s and 90s, and then realize that there is this virtual world, digital world, and therefore in our mind that line is still very clear, that right now I am in the real world, the moment I start looking at my phone I move into the digital world. But now we seem to be transitioning, as Mr. Zuckerberg is threatening, into what he calls the metaverse, or what many people call the metaverse, where there is no line. So, I mean, this question of, is this fake that we are 20 people sitting here listening to you, or because you're right in front of us? What if you were on a screen and we were looking at you? So how do we, the oldies like me, how do we navigate not just going from the black and white of real to virtual, but something that's both real and virtual at the same time?
Oh, that's a great question. I will wait for other people to make guesses about the fake story,
yes,
and I'll come back to it about why. But it's a fascinating question, and in the book, one of the things that we mention is that we perhaps need to stop using transition as a metaphor of thinking of these things, as if you are going to move from one system to the other, and there is a direct correlation between the two. Because there is with digital verification systems and hence fakeness, there is a shift in the first order of truth-telling. Right? So the basic principles that were philosophically and historically constructed in identifying truth in a variety of different disciplines has been shaken. And in my own section, I write about how this is a very particular shift, which is a shift from logic, from mathematics to logic, and from possibility to probability. And I've been working on this, and some of you might have heard me explain it before, but I'm going to do it anyway once because it's always such a good refresher. So, if I was to throw this bottle up in the air, and if I ask you what would happen next, I'm sure almost all of us will say that the bottle will come down, right? And we don't need to be taught principles of gravity, we don't need to understand relativity, we don't need to understand E is equal to mc squared, whatever that might mean, in order to know that the bottle will come down. The reason we do this is because we know from experience that if we throw things up, they come down, and the chances are so high that every time we throw things up that they come down, that this is the logical outcome for it, right? So, congratulations, you now officially an algorithm because you just conducted an act of pattern recognition, right? And our computational networks are necessarily wedded to this first order of logic in terms of telling truths and verifying things. Because if I was to ask the same question to a room full of people who were doing advanced mathematics, they would be paralyzed and would not be able to give me an answer. Because a mathematician would have to construct every single possibility that might happen when this bottle is thrown into the air. Right? So especially if they're now dealing with uncertain physics and quantum physics, they would have to at least compute one possibility where if I throw the bottle up in the air, a wormhole opens up, the bottle travels through it, it goes into another dimension where another Nishant is doing the talk, drops on his head and kills him, thus starting a good Netflix show about whether this was murder or suicide. Right? So I'm being facetious about it, but the point is that there has always been, within truth-telling principles, a compromise between logic and maths. or what I would call probability and possibility. Increasingly, computational systems are deciding that logic is the only form of verification. That's only statistical mediated forms of is there a probability that this is right or wrong, or true or false, is deciding the kind of things that are happening. To such an extent that in the Netherlands, where I'm living right now, we have had a government which collapsed because we had a 10-year-long taxation scandal where a racist algorithm was profiling people with non-white, non-Dutch names and accusing them of tax fraud even though there was no proof of that. And it led to such a bad fallout that people's children were taken away from their homes because they were convicted of fraud which they had not committed, but an algorithm said so. Right? So this expression of power, which was race encoded in logic, and this probability that if you are a non-white person in the Netherlands, the chances of you committing crime are so high and tax fraud are so high that we can actively persecute you without any evidence in this space. This is no longer a question of whether it's digital and on your screen or physical in your life. The screen is merely an interface to the digital, but the digital is all around us. And so I would say that this is where our new challenges are going to be. Are we going to give in to logic as the only way of being? I mean, the fanboy in me is very happy to think that we are going to be a colony of Mr. Spock, right? Like logic and data are the only things that drive our worlds. But then what kind of a world is that? And what are the kinds of interventions that we need to make in order to hopefully not make it happen is going to be the challenge. So that is looking at the first order principles that computation works with is interesting because it immediately lets you realize that there is no correlation between human truth-telling and computational verification. We try it through metaphors, we try it through different forms of transitions, we try to imagine that what we are doing online is a representation of the world that we are in, but we need to stop that thought because it's not. It's two completely different paradigms of meaning making. And the book is kind of trying to address the conflict or the gray space in that particular area.
It's quite schizophrenic in that sense. I mean, to constantly.
What is schizophrenic?
So it's quite, this being in this, negotiating between spaces can get very difficult, like Ravi said. And it also opens up a lot of questions to do with legal systems and, with the way forward. And it actually does appear very scary, honestly, to me.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm not sure of schizophrenia, but maybe neurosis is a much better way of perhaps dealing with it. My current work is actually trying to think through digital paranoia, so I'm getting very paranoid about naming these psychoanalytic conditions more and more. But I think neurosis is something that many people have theorized in trying to deal with this particular idea. So Kelly Dobson, who is a robotics engineer who produces therapeutic machines of different kinds, she has a wonderful book called Machine Therapy, where she says that if we want to build machines which take care of us, right, we have to establish the fact that one is a stable thing and one is a neurotic thing. Right? Because you can't have a neurotic machine looking after you. That is insane. And she has a wonderful experiment where she has these robots called Onos. And Ono is this thing which is kind of roughly the size of an infant baby, and you can hold it, and it's very, very sensitive in its membrane structure and the robotics that go into it, that it responds to your breathing patterns, your body temperature, even just the sensations and the movements that your body is making. And I can't tell you what a wonderful feeling it is to hold an Ono. Right? It's a thing which kind of pulsates gently, and it's a companion robot, and it's in fact used for people with social anxiety to train them. But Kelly does a great thing with Ono. Ono is a neurotic robot, in terms that it recognizes and learns your patterns, and at some point it stops responding. You have no idea the anxiety of lifting something which always responds to you and it stops. And then you have to literally change your entire body's patterns and rhythms in order to make Ono start responding again. Right? And she says that this is the digital neurosis condition that we are a part of. Our technologies, as I mentioned, continuously update and change. And every time they do, it's our responsibility to start adapting to them, saying, "Ab mera kya hoga?" Right? Like, why am I not being counted? Why is my fingerprint not working? Why is my password being forgotten? Why am I blocked out of my system? So, Kelly in machine therapy, and so we build, she's also one of my references, and we build on the argument here, is to say that the presupposition in human technology interaction when it comes to fakeness, truthness and interaction is that the human is the neurotic thing and the machine has to be the stable one which is continuously providing care and therapy, order and truthfulness to this messy entity that you call the human. Right? And she kind of reverses it, and that it's actually the exact opposite. That your machines are incredibly neurotic things. They do things which they don't know why they do them. Right? Like she also has a wonderful art installation where she puts an Ono onto a washing machine and she makes them talk to each other, very much like the two Google Home Assistants who also talk to each other. The two Google Home Assistants are definitely neurotic, right? But all the people who were cheering into it, and there were laughter and cries and emotional outbursts, and when a proposal was made and then it got rejected and so on, those people were considered neurotic in that particular instance. So the book is not taking a position, but it is trying to kind of mine this grey space between the two systems. And I think one of the things that was exciting for us was to let go of the idea that one system has to transition into the other. It is two parallel worlds. You can make the inroads, but it's not a correlation in any way. I'm still curious, Tana, which story do you think is the
No, I don't think any of them are fake. I think they're all.
How dare you?
I don't think any are fake. I think they're all.
Yes.
I'm not sure how my question is going to make sense, but still my question is, like, suppose say we have a screen and there's a word this side and the word other side. How do we say which word is fake and which word is truth? And my second question, and just to add something, sometimes we think about something and we convince ourselves, do we term it as a fake because we are not willing to do that thing, but we are still doing it? Do we term it as fake? And my second question is, being a human, how are we capable, how capable we are to think if something is fake or a truth?
Oh, these are both great questions. I think the question of the screen is in fact the clincher, right? Because let's not think about this screen, right? Because this screen is a black box. It's a black mirror as we've established it. Imagine that we were sitting in a closed room and you were outside of that room with the door closed. The door is also the screen. It's the same interface as this is an interface. If somebody told you something strange has happened inside, but you cannot walk in and verify it, how would you know if it's the truth or not? Right? But we would. And then immediately there is an order of truth-telling which comes into being. The person who has communicated this to you is somebody you trust. And that person is telling you, "Ki ye hua hai," right? This is what has happened. And so you're saying, okay, maybe that's what has happened. In fact, it can be with such authority that you will also go and tell 15 other people that I have not seen it, but this is what has happened. And those 15 people will think you are a trustful person, so we're also going to trust you that this is what's going to happen. Right? So the question of how do you trust something that you do not witness is not a new question. In fact, Ashish, who's sitting here, has a wonderful, at least when he was teaching me, had told us about how people can consume cinema without ever watching a film. Right? That Ashish, you gave us an example long ago in class about how people can have seen Sholay even without ever seeing Sholay. Because people tell you about Sholay, there are references to it all the time. And so every time somebody says Kitne Aadmi The, whether you've seen the film or not, you know that it's Gabbar Singh and that it is Sholay at any given point. Right? So what the digital is essentially doing is, it's saying that whether you witness it or not is no longer important as long as a digital device has captured it. So it's not your memory of it, it's not your trusting of it, it is what the algorithm says is true. And if an algorithm said that something happened in this room, so we can do that, right? There is a camera right here, which is filming this. If we basically tomorrow go and say that at Nishant's book talk there was a riot and we destroyed the whole thing and we walked away, and if all of us insist that that's what happened, we would still be liars because the camera said that's not what's happened. Right? So it's not about whether something is true or not, but how something is being verified. And we've always had human systems of verification which are increasingly becoming more digitalized in different ways. And these digital systems have a different order and a different logic of saying whether something is true or not. And that's the challenge that we have. We don't have an answer, but it's definitely a challenge. Right? And you face it in many different ways, including, for example, with biometric identification through Aadhaar-like systems, or the kind of geolocation that's happening with Arogya Setu. There is this continuous thing of where are you here, are you who you say you are, and so on and so forth. Right? So there's lots of verification systems which go into that. And the second question that you have, which is, as human beings, did we ever have the capacity to tell the truth or not, right, is precisely at the heart of the Turing test. And that's why, of course, Tana has already kind of punctured my big reveal moment, is of course all the stories are true. But because it came with a protocol from me which insisted that one of them is a lie, if I put a gun to your face, I will not. If I put a gun to your head and said, but call one of them fake, you will. Even though you were not convinced that it's fake, even though I've given you evidence about it, if you had to choose, you will. Right? And this is the strange thing. When an algorithm actually gives you something, you know those Google CAPTCHA images which say identify what is a road, what is a car? If you mark something which you think has a car in it and the algorithm says it's not, then you are stupid. Right? It puts you up and saying you are not a human, verify again. So it's these processes which are not about whether something is intrinsically true or not, but what happens when our computational systems are necessarily the things that decide for us that this is the truth and this is not, and how do you kind of deal with that. So my essay deals with it, but actually my other two collaborators, Alexandra Yuas and Chanel Langlois, also write about it in very different ways. So that's why the book is also fun. It's not just written by me, but it's the three of us in collaboration, and there are many different things that they chat out. I will refrain from explaining their parts right now.
That's very interesting. When you're speaking about this whole thing about the fake news thing, right? So I was always interested in this liminal space. Like on the one hand, there are people who get this WhatsApp forwards and believe it, and take it. And on the other end, we also kind of give a higher moral authority to the people who verify these things, So those mandates also given. So I think the truth is somewhere in between, and that's what you brought about. That was very interesting for me because we always tend to go at authority figures and we kind of give certain weightage more to them than to the other facts that might be there traveling around us as well. So and coming from creative space, for me, it's always about ambiguity, about the idea of gray areas. And so the whole, the thing that I would like to ask, how do we kind of bypass these notions of authority, moral grounding, standing, the only way out perhaps is to challenge them, combat them in the way we can, but is there anything that you have in mind in particular which you would like to share?
That's a great question, thank you. And particularly this idea of some authority figures which can be trusted. So Pew, which is this scientific study of where information comes in, had reported that the European Union published more than 1,000 instances of fake news as official news over the last 4 years. Right? And then they had to retract it and they had to apologize saying, "Galti se error ho gaya," right? Like this is wrong information been sent out. It's always generally a human error, something which was not supposed to be said, sent out, a typo was created. Somebody did not have access to credentials and did that. So what's interesting is that with the digital spaces, you do have a new egalitarianism where every source is potentially a source of fakeness. So I don't know, ever since I've landed in India, from the airport onwards, they keep on telling me that 100 crore vaccinations have happened in this country and we should all get vaccinated and so on and so forth. And it immediately brings to the question saying, give me the source. And once they give me the source, I have to then go and verify saying, how do I trust this source? Can I do it 3 more times? Can I look at 5 different levels? Going back to the Turing test, the question is not whether a source is valid or not, but I have lost the capacity of trusting a source without verifying it. That is an enormous amount of burden on an individual to have. At some point, I'm just going to give up, saying 100 crore, हाँ ठीक है हो गया, right? Vaccine नहीं आ गई, okay हो गया. I can't bother with it because the amount of information that's coming to me is all coming as if it is authoritative, right? Because the state and the rumor monger are both talking to me in exactly the same medium, which is WhatsApp. And when I get a message from 3 different sources which are contradictory, what do? I either go to verify each one of them, or I give up and say, I don't care about this news at all. That means apathy and resignation.
Enforced variability.
Enforced verifiability is called fascism.
Enforced variability.
Gullibility, yeah, but otherwise enforced verification is fascism, which is also something not desirable. But in the book we do make a plea saying that instead of trying to figure out whether things are fake or not, maybe it's time to go back to thinking about other kinds of truths that we tell. And those kinds of truths are in fiction, they are in poetry, they are in personal relationships. And at least in my piece I talk about building communities of care, communities that hold the truth which is important for them, as opposed to networks of scale where information has to travel. So going back to that particular mode and increasingly using digital computational networks to create more communities who give embodied holding to the truth that is important, and not an individual person or an individual institution, but this collective which can come together, might be one way of approaching these new forms of truth-telling and new forms of verification, which might still be dealing with unstable truths and alternative facts, but at least it will allow for a negotiation with them, as opposed to just a resignation from them and saying, I can't deal with this anymore.
In a way, you answered the question I had in mind, coming from the creative space. I had written something from some time ago, and this is Herb Simon, a professor at Carnegie Institute. He said once that capacities we are having real trouble getting machines to simulate are not the higher orders of faculties confined to man, but rather the ones we share with the lower animals. That's where the real trouble is happening for the AI and the machine learning to really figure out how do we do that. And as all of us are, moved to the digital, having our digital twins and living in that world, the question of identity becomes imperative for the capital to move, because without it, no clear destination, there is no place for it to move. So for us to have a clear address is imperative for the system. So then there is no way you can, if you're out of that sort of address, you no longer can exist and cannot tolerate that. So it's more of a question, for me, this is bringing out as a question of space in between truth and fake. What is that space, and the way you sort of responded to it. So for me, that is becoming increasingly more and more important, the space of irrationality. Like what is, how do we negotiate that in the binary order of things? How do we work with it, negotiate it in this space? So that is.
No, thanks for bringing that up. So Alexandra Rivas in her piece has a beautiful formulation which says, I know this to be the truth, but I can't tell it for a fact. Right? And she says, we live this every day. I know this to be the truth, but I can't tell it to be the fact. And what do I do with that? Because it's precisely that information which cannot be verified. So both Alex and I also draw upon one particular reference which you might find interesting. His name is Duncan Watts. Duncan Watts is considered to be the father of contemporary computational engineering, especially network engineering. And Watts in 2003 wrote this book called The Small World Phenomenon, which is a very mathematical paper, but it's worth investing kind of reading into it. Because Watts, as a computational systems engineer, said something very strange. He said, the computational world is not a derivative, a representation or a mirror of real life. It is merely an extractive statistical model which selects at its convenience data points that it can compute and puts that into a model and pretends that it is more real than the other. Yeah? He says this is the basis of computational simulation. So anybody who's trying to, when we talk about data mining or human farming or emotional and affective computing, it's not about trying to mimic what human societies and individuals are doing. It's simulating, which means it's not representation but simulating an alternative reality which is in essence fake. So in the Small Worlds book, Duncan Watts comes out and says computation in its ontology, both in terms of human meaning making as well as in its architecture and code, is fake. Yeah? It is a simulation. Us trying to make sense of it and trying to incorporate it back into our lives as if it is something that we can align ourselves to is futile efforts, because you're fighting a lost battle over there. And I think that has been a really interesting challenge, and Watts has been demonized and dismissed by a whole bunch of AI commercial exploits, because people like Facebook, for example, will insist that they are human networks which are being run on computational technologies. They are computational networks which sometimes also have human beings because they are important for their data sets to make profits and to generate value. So Watts' work kind of makes that inversion possible. And so it's also really interesting where the conversations are in machine learning, especially right now. Right? I have a PhD student who's just completing her thesis. I mean, she submitted it, she's defending it in 3 months. Her name is Maya Indira Ganesh, and she is completed her work on ethics in autonomous moving vehicles. So she goes from the history of the black box in the flights, about flight simulators and how machines largely run over airplanes, to the trolley problem, right? The ethics trolley problem that's always given to you with a self-driving car. So, you know, the trolley problem is very self-evident. You are driving down the road, there is kids here, old people here, you have to kill one of those two, which one will you kill? And Maya kind of looks at the history of that ethical staging and said, till the longest period, the only acceptable answer was I will kill myself so that I don't have to take the responsibility of what happens next. But with the trolley problem, the problem is now that you are in a killing machine. It's presumed that the car is a killing machine, and it's giving you only 2 options. And one of them is supposed to be an ethical choice. Right? This is a different way of thinking through truth navigations and value generations. This is about a system which is basically computing ethics only through binaries of kill 1, kill 0. And there is no way out of it. But there has to be a different way of thinking through it. And our thesis actually does fantastic ethnographies with AI engineers to see what happens if we don't allow you to think of ethics in binaries. And that is a question that paralyzes engineers, because they have been told that machine logic is going to supersede human forms of thought and the human has to fit into it. And our work shows what happens if you say, no, this is the human form of being. Now develop a technology that works within that. And maybe that is the beginning point perhaps of also not just new forms of, human collectives and so on, but also new forms of coding and new forms of programming and building new systems, which I think is perhaps something that needs to be taught in engineering schools. The time will come. Maybe just one last question or comment before we can wrap up. Ashish, I know you might have hand up.
No, exactly the ideal question to ask at the end of my the two, 3 things. One, I suppose it does connect up the end of both the question, both answers just now when you talked about this binarization of the true-false thing and this verifiability aspect. I wanted to say, for example, that I didn't know which of those 3 stories were true or false, and I suspect it doesn't matter. And I suspect that when you are given this true, false, choose one, you want to actually say, should I really be forced into that kind of situation? Which leads me to ask you as to whether 2 aspects, 2 disciplinary aspects. One is basically the theological, the origins of the idea of truth itself, and then the more specifically political would feature, because these two disciplines didn't seem to feature that centrally in your talk today. And of course, I know at least the political aspect is very central to your, just for example, this thing about did the January 6th, whatever attack on Capitol happen at all? And Trump says it did not. There are sufficient numbers of people who believe that is so. And that might well be so even if there was a riot today and the camera said there wasn't one. Enough people will disbelieve the camera and believe us. So there's some other question around truth which I think may need to be asked, which I was wondering whether you want to throw light on. Which is basically this, that if truth was historically seen in its origins to be a revelatory structure, then the use of truth for rational purposes to be susceptible to verification at all may actually be a foundational problem which has a long history to it, right? And so this thing about the distinction between mathematics and logic and many other disciplines that are founded in, and law, which are founded on the assumption of verifiable truth, it themselves may need to be challenged, or may need to be questioned. So you have what's very interesting is that digitization now opens up a long history. And in that long history lies another problem. One is, for example, the kind of origins of perspective and objective reality. They say, for example, perspective itself is founded on a lie because parallel lines do not meet it. So there's a fundamental kind of a flaw, or a fundamental sort of an ambiguity to the very idea of rationality and so on. And I wanted to say another thing, which is that in India, when you mentioned cinema, and when in the early silent cinema, the use of technologies of oil painting and so on were used to show how, Ravana killed Jatayu as plausible, as actually potentially true stories. And this then extended in the silent cinema to use of special effects in a way that Indian audiences never saw as fake or falsifiable or anything like that, causing, of course, another kind of political crisis. There was a certain way in which I think this revelatory aspect of truth may have actually had a consistency to it, right? Which may need to be sort of rethought in the light of this consistent kind of denigration of the concept of truth itself, which I suspect I would accuse you of doing in saying that here are 3 stories, choose one of them is false. Just precisely not the point.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So I'm wondering whether you might want to kind of throw light on that aspect of it, which I imagine is part of your thinking but didn't feature today, about the ethical theological aspect of it, you might say, or with extending into politics.
So we don't talk about politics, we talk about cute cats. I have been told to say that repeatedly in India right now. This is not a political book, it's a book about cats and what happens to people who are not cats. I'm just joking. So 2 things. I think the idea that there has been this investment in the moment of truth as the moment of revelation is in fact something that for us, at least intellectually, Turing kind of came and destabilized. Right? Because he said that not only is your capacity of telling for sure whether something is human or not is shaken, but the end verification is also only with that object. That object will reveal and then in that process tell you whether you succeeded or not in that process. So we were going through that particular trajectory, and it is perhaps evident in what our editors kept on calling the scattered nature of our writing, that in the 11 small sections there are literally 11 different disciplines and ideas that we are kind of throwing this at, perhaps to give a canvas of how fundamental the problem has become. That it looks like it's a technological problem, sometimes it looks like it is a lived reality problem, but almost every different story is throwing up a challenge either to law or to visual cultures or to different kinds of governance systems. So there is also a small section on Aadhaar over it, which talks about questions of legibility and falsification which go into it. But I think at that point, this is what we wanted to do with the book, is really to start making space for saying if truth, as we have historically, technologically understood it, is not going to be the jumping off point in order to make several kinds of claims and rights and discourses and critiques, then what else do you do? because it looks like then the other only default is technological verification. Right? Use these algorithms and these technological networks in order to stand in for this moment of uncertainty that's in it. And again, as Alex very clearly points out, if I had to choose between an uncertain human and an unknowing algorithm, I'd much rather choose poetry. Right? That there has to be a space which is in poetry and fiction in order to kind of bring this apart. I mean, of course, these are very large questions and this is a very small book. So the book is also kind of intended more as us thinking out loud about what are the different kinds of things emerging from that historical moment of the Turing test and the ways in which it's being engineered, so to speak, right now. I don't think any of us had the capacity to make a theological argument or even touch that particular history of truth-telling, but Chanel in her piece does talk about how we need to start thinking about the appearance of truth not as a moment of knowing but as a moment of provocation. And she said the essential problem with contemporary discourse and why everything is polarized is because a truth value is immediately seen as a provocation as opposed to something which you can participate in. And I think that's a really interesting move that she makes there. Yeah, one last point.
So this is going to sound really, really neurotic, but here's the thing. I've been focusing on, sorry, I'm not used to my notes. I've been focusing on not so much the truth, but the fake. So this is the other end of the spectrum, if you will. And I'm thinking about fake and its, its historic origins or its historicity and what it might mean and so on. And it also strikes me that fake and faux are not very far apart. That, very often, I'm thinking politically in terms of social class, if you will. If I can't afford Peter, back off. If I can't afford, genuine fur, faux fur. So, is being fake so terribly terrible? I read your section, especially the last one, and it got me thinking. Yeah, you can be really fake. That verification, external as it is at this point, needn't necessarily determine who you are. You can take that at face value and leave it at that, and you can continue to build your identities. Plus, there is this huge amount of, historically speaking, and I see how the book does it. You locate the beginning of all of this in, Donald Trump, whose great contribution seems to be fake news, right? So there is this coupling really of fake and information. Whereas fake can be any number of things, right? And in the words of Dickinson, tell all the truth, but tell it slant.
Yeah.
Success in circuit lies. So you're right, I think poetry does make more sense then. I think your last slide had something of that sort. Not all fake stories are, not all real stories are true, and not all fake stories are lies. And I think that's partly the problem because we tend to be so algorithmic about defining what is fake and defining what is a story and defining what is a lie. I think that's about it, really.
No, I think that's one of the reasons why the book was also so much fun to write, because we were also continuously trying to figure out, saying what exactly do each of us mean when we say things like truth and lie and fake, and every time we had that conversation and we would stare at each other on Zoom screens because we were writing it through the pandemic together, there would be this moment of hair clutching saying, basically maybe it's not important, right? Like the only way by which we could collaborate, three people who know each other for a very long time, was to suspend our one definition or one fixity of what the truth is and so on, which is why in the book we also had fun because Alex and I have the same subheadings in our chapter. So if you look at the table of contents, it's two essays with exactly the same subheadings, but they say completely different things, and they are not they're contradictory and they cannot be reconciled, and that's fine too, right? So the burden of reconciliation is something that technologies put upon us all the time, and we kind of trace it back a little bit in the book, especially with Alex's opening part, where we talk about saying, so she has this particular thing where there is an image of people looking at somebody, and then she looks at herself looking at the image of people looking at somebody, and then within that she looks at the circulation of the image being looked at, of her looking at. So there's like this constant kind of feedback loop. Every time that image gets shared, there is one more layer of somebody looking at somebody else, and so on. And then she says the point is that if you start tracing this in original or traditional forms of truth-telling, this becomes either dismissed as redundancy or somebody who's gone into a neurotic spiral. And then she says, but within this is the politics of feminist care and remembering. And when we were writing it, it's never made it to the book. I was making Alex read Terry Pratchett, where in Going Postal, Pratchett says that no one is forgotten till their name is bouncing off technology towers time and again. Right? So there's a certain nostalgia perhaps for memory which drives us. And it was really nice because once you move from storage back into memory, you can suspend with the idea of what is the truth and what is the fake. That my memory is going to be a collection of things that I'm willfully remembering, but things I'm accidentally forgetting, but also things that I might not have experienced, but I still think that I did, and that we need to make space for that. And so we keep on going back to art, poetry, and fiction as spaces from there to deal with. And for me, it's interesting because I'm now working on a new project called Doing Things with Stories, and it kind of picks up from this book and say, in the face of misinformation, in the face of information overload, what we really want to just do is tell stories and figure out what we want to do with them. But that's perhaps a good hook for a next book talk, hopefully in a few years, if that comes about. But I think my voice is now slowly dying, so that's a good
I think you should let Nishant go. Thank you all so much for coming. Thank you all for coming. It's clear win without the mic, I imagine. Thank you for all the wonderful provocative questions, which I hope Nishant has adequately answered. And I know some of the questions are prodding him on to his next project. It's also very wonderful. Thank you so much, Nishant, for spending this time with us. Nishant is also conducting a faculty workshop for some of our colleagues who are developing online courses for the university. I don't think any one of them is here, but they will get to meet Nishant at that point. Thank you again for that also, Nishant.
No, thank you very much. It's wonderful to be in Ahmedabad and to have this space. For me, this is hallowed ground. The last time I was here, one of my favorite ex-professors, who refused to be called that now anymore, Rita Kothari, did a launch of her last translation book here, and I was here. So to be in this space and then to find all these intersections with Teju coming to Ahmedabad University and finding Anchor here is wonderful. I just want to give a shout out to Puni. I don't know if she's still here. Thank you so much for arranging all the logistics, which just kept on changing to finally get me here and make this possible. And of course the bookstore for arranging this. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much to the